Good morning, everyone. It's 10 a.m. on March 25th. This is Margie Tatro with GridWorks and with my colleagues Deb Shields and perhaps Kathy Boyes if she can join us. We're pleased to host this conversation between stakeholders and EPE regarding the demand-side management model run requests that several people have offered some ideas for, and we wanted to engage this group to try to solidify the parameters for the demand-side management modeling requests. Judy, let me ask if we have Ben on. There's Ben just on cue. We've got the EPE and E3 team here today to help structure the parameters for modeling runs. I'd like to mention that there were 3 stakeholders who turned in so far a modeling run request related to this topic of demand-side management. And those are Don Kurtz, Steve Fishman, and Ramon Alatorre from Sweep. I'm hoping Ramon will join us because I think the specifications in his model run were some of the most explicit for this topic, and I'm hoping we can begin with that and then augment or amplify or modify as stakeholders feel is appropriate. Um, so Ben and Angie, Judy, Michelle, let me turn the conversation over to you all, and I can pull up any of the model run requests that have come in on this topic, or perhaps you want to explain to this group of stakeholders how your base runs are already including what degree of demand-side management on the load side are already included. That might create a good foundation for our conversation. So, and I see Ramon has joined us. Great, Ramon, thank you. I just mentioned that the demand-side management model requests that you all put together from SWEEP, and maybe you're working collaboratively with the Coalition for Clean Affordable Energy, was well specified and defined. There may be a couple of gaps there, but thank you for putting that in. I'm hoping our conversation today can begin with the requests that you all put in, and we can augment or modify as necessary. So Ben, Michelle, Judy, Rhonda, Angie, let me turn it over to you all to carry this conversation, and know that we are here to support the conversation.
Hey, Marjorie, I'll just quickly jump in just before we get started. Just to let you know, Chris Hickman reached out to me this morning. I think he has some interest in joining this group, and I asked him to contact you. I'm not sure if he did.
Judy, let's see. I have not talked with him. Deb, could you go online and
Sure.
send Chris Hickman the invitation for this, please? That would be great.
Course.
Thanks, Ben. We'll include him in the conversation if he can join us.
Will do right now.
Thank you.
Hey, good morning. I'll start us off. So first of all, I wanted to thank all of the stakeholders who are on the call right now who provided or expressed interest in looking at demand side management, energy efficiency, load management programs. I think it's very beneficial that we're having our stakeholders get together that have very similar interests. And we appreciate the opportunity to work with you all and talk to you today on how to collaborate some of those modeling requests. Just a quick update. I'm very pleased to announce that our SharePoint is up and running. So you all should have received a request via email that gives you access to that. So that's where we will be putting the inputs, the information that you were requesting in addition to the stakeholder requests. Some of them have already been distributed via email, but in addition to that, that will be acting as a repository for that. We will also be having our modeling request information that you all submitted. Those will be in there as well, and you all should have access to it. So I think the purpose of this call today, and yeah, Margie, I think it would definitely be helpful to pull up the specific modeling requests that have been submitted on behalf of this group to date. I think a majority of the information will be coming from Ben Elzey from E3, who is our expert here, just to kind of walk us through some of those, let you know about what's in the model to date with regards to, the demand side management and how we can better collaborate as a group here and answer your questions on the modeling requests.
Excuse me, Margie, just to jump in just real quickly. I'm happy to talk for 55 minutes, but I would prefer this be kind of more of a discussion. So, please feel free, anyone, to jump in as we start going through these requests. The hope from me for today's meeting was to obviously answer any questions the stakeholders had, excuse me, and then also to help kind of facilitate the modeling stakeholder request form. So please feel free to jump in with any questions. And, the goal really would be to try and get some sort of consensus from this group where we end up with maybe 1 or 2 scenarios as opposed to 10 very, very similar scenarios.
So Ben, I'm going to suggest 2 paths forward. First, perhaps 2 options. We can start with Ramon's request because I think it's the most specific. Before we do that, I don't know if anybody on your team wanted to describe what is your base model run in terms of its consideration of these resources, the demand side management resources, in terms of its impact on the demand curve. So is there something, do you want to give people some information about the starting point for your modeling of this particular parameter in your runs?
Yeah, and I don't have the materials in front of me, Margie, unfortunately, but I can kind of just briefly talk to what's kind of in the models right now. So right now, the models are based on the company's or EPE's forecast. So embedded within the forecast, we have existing energy efficiency programs. And then Judy, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but what I heard in prior meetings is the projections for energy efficiency would align with the company's New Mexico filings. So that's the piece from the energy efficiency side. On demand response, there is currently some demand response on the system. Let me just pull up the numbers. From memory, it's around 25 megawatts, but let me bring up the exact numbers. Rhonda sent this to me last night. It may be while I'm looking for this, Margie, did any of the actual stakeholders have any specific data they were looking for just while I'm pulling this up? Okay. Here, and Margie, do we want to start, maybe do this back to front just while I'm pulling this data up? I hate people to wait just while I'm looking for information. Do you mind just maybe starting with the Ramon's request?
Yeah, sure. Let's do that. Let me go ahead and pull up. And Ramon, we're going to turn to you to talk through the requests that you put in. I will share it. I don't know if folks can see it. I sent it to those who I thought were interested in this topic already, but let me call it up here and then ask you to walk through it if you could. Okay, Ramon, you should be able to see it.
Margie, if I could ask you just to make it a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
My eyes are not what they used to be. So thank you.
Is that better? I'll just kind of highlight the midsection here, since that I think is key. Go ahead, Ramon.
Great. I guess I'll start just by saying thanks for organizing this. The 3rd workshop was the first workshop that I had an opportunity to engage in this process. So I didn't get to attend the first 2 workshops, and I will admit that I had to do so remotely. And I know that it was kind of a better experience for those that were in the room. So thanks for continuing to organize this around those of us that are having to work remotely. My sense was that you were looking for some requests with some specific, I guess, specificity to the request in terms of how much, what type of DR, how callable, and things of that nature. So that was part of what was going on here. I guess I have sort of 3 flavors of requests. Certainly when we're doing when we're engaging around the region, we are seeing a lot of consternation around load growth. And I know this was talked about a lot, but I think there is concern around some of the speculative nature You spoke to how confident you were in sort of the base plus large load customers. But I think we were interested in just requesting sort of a lower bound, even lower than that one, as a sort of piece of the of what is considered. And so that's the very first one, I guess, is the no new gas plus just the base load only. And then the second and third, we call them just a high time of use saturation scenario and a high time of use saturation scenario with aggressive uh, demand response programming. You know, if capacity is sort of the big concern, wanting to see what the models would solve for if we were imagining a future where a high saturation of residential as well as commercial and industrial customers were on you know, a time of use rate plan that would hopefully make less serious, I suppose, some of those most difficult hours, difficult times. And so we threw in some numbers around 80% of commercial and industrial load, 90% of residential customers on time of use rates. And then also some additional DR, I think above and beyond some of what we have seen in the EPE's energy efficiency and load management filings, just recognizing that you know, those have been filed for the short term. It would be interesting to see what would happen if we sort of turn the dial up on those. So those were sort of the conceptual. I can say that the sort of levels of the 8 megawatts and 5 megawatts, some of that had to do with reviewing what is going on in New Mexico in the SPS territory and their recently proposed interruptible credit tariff, and comparing their CNI customers and you know, how much they are selling compared to EPE. I think it's like 1/4 is what EPE has. So sort of took their program and divided it by 4. And that's sort of how we arrived at some of these numbers. I think I just heard that you all were modeling something like 25 megawatts of demand response. So, you know, obviously this would be sort of increasing that by about 50%, but we're kind of looking for that, what would be an aggressive DR programming scenario as well. And wanting those to, I guess, be some of the situations that are potentially either modeled or solved for in a future like piece of this, but that is, I guess, the high level thinking of the nature of this request. And I'm happy to have the conversations to understand how to sort of morph this into a request that your team can work with.
So, Ramon, do you mind if I just repeat back some of what you just said, just to make sure I fully grasped it first, and then we can jump into some of the details after? So, with scenario 1, you're suggesting a load forecast that excludes any large load, including essentially signed contracts?
Yes.
Okay. And then for the second one, again, just to confirm here, you would be looking at what would be the lowest load forecast here. So when we say start with no new gas, plus 24 base load, plus large load, you're talking about kind of the most secure large load, the signed contracts, the lowest load forecast, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then a view that 90% residential customers would be on a time of use rate by 2030. So essentially just grow that linearly from today's numbers. Do you have any data that you would like to suggest in terms of how that impacts load, or would you want EPE to kind of look at what historically has happened there?
I think we were interested in seeing what your all's model would see as being the impact of sort of that, you know, transition towards significant time of use saturation. We could look for some data, but I didn't have any particular data that I was expecting it would you know, look like XYZ. I think it probably depends on you know, the exact nature of the time of use sort of program, and using what you know, EPE has either done historically or is thinking about would be appropriate.
Okay. And then the 80% of CNI, that's existing CNI, or you're also kind of assuming the large load, the data centers would also be on a time of use rates program?
80% of, I guess that scenario of the 24 base load and large loads. So if that's the load scenario, I want to see 80% of it on a time of use rate.
And it's that last bit that I'm struggling with a little, just with the large load having such a high load factor, right? It's more challenging that for them to be on a time of use type rate. But let's put some numbers together. I think you could make, they could be on the rate, but I'm not sure how that's actually going to impact their sales or their energy usage. So let's maybe put a pin in that one, and we can kind of run some numbers and come back to you. Okay. And then as we go through, so 8 megawatts from CNI by 2030. So you were saying a 4-hour interruptible program there. Any thoughts, any suggestions on kind of number of call outs per year, or when that program can be called upon, or are you looking at unlimited?
I would have to relook at what SPS has put forward, and I know another handful of other utilities in the region. I seem to recall something to the effect of 180 hours is callable in 4-hour calls. If I were to just say off the top of my head.
Sorry. This is Leslie Padilla. I'm on in my car, unfortunately. But Ramon, I have a quick question for you on that. What are you're referring to a recent SPS tariff filing in New Mexico?
Correct. Yes, SWEEP and CCAE are involved in the SPS. They're calling it the quadrennial for their energy efficiency and load management program. I believe they have suggested this interruptible credit in the past, and then the PRC requested that they sort of refile it in this quadrennial. So we've been evaluating that, and we've seen similar sort of interruptible credit programs throughout the region and throughout the nation. But it seems like a really interesting way to be able to get sort of a huge shedding of load at critical moments for the grid.
Okay, and this would apply to their existing customer, because the commercial base is mostly oil and gas production, right?
In SPS territory, it is, yes.
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then just Ramon, last question from me on the DR for residential. So you're saying 5 megawatts of DR there. 3 megawatts would be utility controlled DR, and the remaining 2 megawatts would be on thermostat program. Okay, that makes total sense to me. Okay, I've got no further questions. Ramon, just as we start working through this, I may come back to you just with some more details, just number of call outs per year, seasons per year. I think this request makes sense. The only piece that just like my initial kind of reaction is just the time of use rates for the data center load. Just I'm not sure how that's going to work, but we can work through that. Okay, perfect. So this looks good to me. Margie, do we want to pull up the next request here?
Yeah, let me pull up Dawn's. I think Dawn, yours was the next most very related but specific. Let me see if Dawn, you want to start talking through it? I'll pull it up here while you describe it.
Yeah, it's a very simple one. I would like to model a generic demand response scenario to determine the system impact if aggregate demand response from all sources were to constitute 5%, 10%, and 15% of overall peak load by 2030. And I think Ben said earlier that 25 megawatts is what is currently done. And what are we using as a round figure for the overall load? I don't know if we're just looking at New Mexico customers or system when we do this, but what are we talking about overall?
So sorry to interrupt. Let me just go back just real quickly because I want to confirm the numbers. I had 25 megawatts in my head. but I'm looking at in New Mexico, it's 16 megawatts. Rhonda, if you're here, do you mind just telling me on this loads and resources table what year this is that you sent me?
It's 2025.
Okay, so in 2025, Don, sorry, the total demand response in Rhonda, please jump in and correct me if I'm wrong here, but demand response is 16 megawatts in New Mexico on a 359 megawatt peak. So that would be 4.5%. And then on the total system, so including Texas, demand response total 79 megawatts on a 2,133 system peak. So that is just shy of 4%.
Okay, great. And so my rationale is I called into service my own enormous research team through Google AI. And it said that around the country, I asked it the question, how do I model demand response? What amount of demand response can be modeled and something like that? And what percent of peak demand can demand response provide for electric utility planning? And it was between 5 and 18% is what people were putting into their models. And so I felt like we were on the low side. And I started thinking, well, just to give us something to shoot at by 2030, if we could in fact reach these higher thresholds of demand response, how much of a difference would that make in terms of the whether we needed new plants or whatever? So I think it's to set some more robust and aspirational understanding of what we could accomplish.
So Don, just some follow-up questions just real quickly. So it looks like we're just shy on both a system and a New Mexico basis of the 5% mark right now.
Mm-hmm.
So my thought is that the 5% probably isn't going to provide much value. We're essentially there. So if we look at the higher two numbers, the 10 and 15%, are you thinking total system peak, just residential load? What's your thoughts there?
You know, Ben, I'm probably out of thoughts there. I mean, I just had this conceptual thing, so I'm certainly open to advice and thoughts of other members, but I don't really know what would be the right things. But I'd like to set it high enough that low enough that it's in fact within the realm of possibility, but high enough that we get a sense of whether it would be a good thing to move more robustly in that arena than we have in the past.
Okay, let's do a little bit of research would be my suggestion here. Residential in just traditional CNI would be relatively easy. Really, the question comes down to some of these large data center loads is will they have backup generation, right? Because they're probably not willing to be completely interrupted in terms of like the lights go off. But if they've got backup generation, then they may be willing to be disconnected from the utility service for their demand response program and then implement their backup generation. So let's look at it two different ways. We can do some research there. The other thing that I just want to bring to everyone's attention, at the moment, we're talking about demand response as a solution to gross peak, right? So demand's highest time. EP is a little bit unique in terms of their electric system, where potentially they can continue to add solar to the system, which solves for gross peak, but then creates a new issue in terms of net peak, where the reliability hours become 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. So let's start with gross peak on demand response. And then when we start seeing the results, if they're not doing what we expect them to do, we can maybe look at a more dynamic DR type program where it's hitting net peak. So we'll start with gross for now and then potentially move to net.
Yeah, I think
I'm just curious if any of my colleagues on the call want to say anything, but I mean, that sounds reasonable to me, you know.
Yeah, I think we're looking at this from a different perspective, where Ramon's talking about doing a price-based using TOU to drive down demand, and then also incentive based to figure out. We're trying to figure out how much is enough. Is it 25 megawatts? Is it 35 megawatts? And how much is enough is how much is representative so that at least in one model prevents the need for new generation plants to be built. So we're just trying to figure out how much, understand how much is needed to offset that. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, absolutely, Randy. The other question that we're going to have when we get into this a little bit more is the constraints of the DR program. So again, Don, going back to my comments to Ramon before, like how often can the program be called upon? I'm assuming maybe a 4-hour program. Can it be called upon all year round or just in certain seasons? What I suggest we probably do is align those same assumptions with Ramon's assumptions. And that way we're not trying to compare two different, very slightly different demand response characteristics. We're just really doing an apples to apples on, okay, what is the right number of demand response? Then we can work on the finer details later.
Cynthia, for PRC staff, I have a couple of comments. I like the idea of doing a generic modeling of reduction to peak, and which is essentially what we're talking about with the Don's DR numbers. And so maybe we could do that first, which is simply what if the New Mexico portion of the system had peak demand, and we can define how the, is that the top 100 hours or whatever. What if it was lower by 10% or 15% based on your forecast, okay? And see what that gives you as a result in terms of, does it provide a significant adjustment to planned resources on the supply side? And then start the conversation of, is that in any way realistic? And then work from there, okay? And the reason why I'm suggesting that is your existing programs, your existing energy efficiency activities and demand response are what I'm going to call old school construct, okay? You've been doing the same thing in the same way pretty much for a long time, okay? You now have a new world that you're ready to step into, which is AMI. And congratulations on being at, 91% of all customers now have AMI meters. And I know from the year 25, 27 load management EE application that is pending before the commission, you discuss as part of you have a stakeholder process there, that the group wanted you to start in on what are the possibilities for EE and demand response with AMI now. And so you're supposedly looking at that with your consultants and such. And so, and then I just note also that your potential study, it makes no mention of AMI. It's based on existing programs. So we've got a little bit of this circularity going on here. And so Ben, if you start in on trying to model a 10% reduction in peak load by 2030 based on the existing construct where, customers can't be called on very often, and you've got all kinds of market participation limitations, which I would like to get into with you more, not so much at this meeting, but to note that you've probably got extremely inefficient HVAC on the system, and you have no time of use rates. And what we're talking about here is this new world of where demand side resources can be, 10 and 20 and 25% of your resource mix, along with generation and transmission. And if your HVAC is if your HVAC is inefficient, and I don't mean just the installed capacity, and I'll just add a side note, I did so much work on HVAC in my 20 years in California, on the implementing of $1 billion a year energy efficiency programs. And so it is such a rat's nest on the way HVAC units are installed and operated and what they do to critical peak when that, anyway.
So yeah, Cynthia, I'm going to stop you and get you back to the topic of the modeling run request. Yeah, these are important points. But
Margie, my point being, let's not try and model the existing construct in a generic way of what happens to the system when you have a 10 and 15% reduction in peak load. Let's look at that. And then does that give us anything aspirational worth shooting at or targeting at? And then let's bring in the discussions of what are you doing with AMI now to, go into the new world. So thank you for the time.
good. Thank you, Cynthia. I wanted to also, Ben, I don't know if you had a response to that. I also want to bring up Steve Fishman's request as the third one that we've received, just to see if there's anything to add from Steve, before we then try to have you, Ben, knit any of these together. So, Steve, I know we had worked during workshop 3, and I'll share what we put together during workshop 3. It really was not, you're still forming the ideas, but where the concept of having base and medium and high levels of demand side management penetration. Of course, you're also interested in follow-on action ideas to try to pilot those. Those aren't part of modeling requests. But Steve, did you want to add anything that hasn't been discussed from Dawn and Ramon's requests that you wanted to add into the conversation?
Well, I'll add a couple of items, and then I've got a write-up that I did in partnership, or actually that Alan Downs did in partnership with me. I want to give him the credit. And I guess I'll send that in just right after this meeting and try and copy the folks. You can get that on the portal.
So Steve, but I'm going to ask you to introduce those ideas if they're new here in this conversation, because we're not planning to get this group back together.
I will.
Okay, thank you.
So first of all, on the prior conversations, some quick input. Ben had mentioned that large C&I, sometimes it's difficult to do for TOU to have an effect because their load factor is so high. And I wanted to say that we shouldn't shy away from programs from those folks on TOU because necessity is the mother of invention. And if you have the TOU there, you create an incentive for people to look harder to find ways to respond. So I just wanted to quick make that comment. Second, regarding large contracts, I think it would be great as part of the IRP to list some basic requirements with some of these large contracts so that people know what kind of impact they will have, and people know that there's certain parameters since these large customers will have a huge impact on the system, that we've set up some parameters for how EPE is working with them, with those large customers. And people have a sense of what's likely to come when contracts get put in place. So just a couple of quick comments there. And actually a third comment is I was noticing on EE with the current case that's out there that, and Sweet might be able to comment some on this, but that on EE for 2027, the administrative costs are creeping up real quickly. And they go up to to about 50% of the total program budget. And while those programs may give us, probably do give us some, efficiency gains and some emissions gains. If 50% is administration, you have to ask the question, is there a new, more efficient way to go about getting those same measures in place that's an alternative to what we're doing now? Because while it may help the system overall, from a management standpoint, 50% waste or 50% administration is an awfully high number. To spend $3 million to give away $3 million in rebates, it bears looking at again. So I'd encourage I'm going to be looking more closely at that. And I think it's a part of this picture, since load management sometimes falls in those EE programs, for all of us to look at that carefully and see if there's a better way to approach that. Any comments?
Steve, Steve, I'm going to encourage you to talk about what modeling run parameters you'd like to look at, as opposed to program implementation. That's where we are right now on the modeling request. So
yeah, so now I'll go to, I'm just trying to create context to think about the modeling there. So anyway, the concept on the one of the concepts that I've got is mandatory TOD rates, which we've talked about and I think are great. I just wanted to say that from a modeling standpoint, I would look at a peak rate as being at least 5 times as high as off-peak. And I think that also, we should model it 3-tier. There should be a super off-peak, and that super off-peak should probably only be, should be 50% or less of just the normal standard charge, off-peak charge. And basically to say that those rates should be very aggressive. And again, should apply across the board to C&I as well. Although maybe for super large customers and data centers, we need to back off some on that aggressiveness because of their load factors. All that makes sense, Ben?
So, Steve, let me have the EPE and E3 team respond to that. I don't think we're modeling rates in this, but Ben, please go ahead and describe that. Could you respond to Steve's idea?
Yeah, thank you. The rates themselves are not modeled. So the only way you could replicate would be the impact to load, right? So if you assumed you had extremely aggressive rate structure, you would in theory push more sales from a period of peak to non-peak. The only thing I would maybe just urge caution on for everyone on this call is, again, I go back to my earlier comment, EP has great access to solar resources, which correlate to peak generation, and not so great access to wind resources. So if you compare it to like PNM and SPS, who have access to great wind, you want to be a little bit careful about pushing too much load into hours where the sun's not shining, because it may be challenging to get renewable resources to meet that load. But now there is a fine line there, right? There's definitely a point where time of use rates can help. I'm just saying, if you shift everything to 2 a.m, you don't have any renewable generation.
Yeah, no, a great point. And I guess what would be interesting is getting an understanding if that limitation on wind is basically a management choice, or if it's if there's some other kind of constraint there. So just something to we need to keep in mind. And I guess I had always thought it was more management choice because we had all the nuclear resources that were taking care of the night, and wind didn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but maybe it'll start to make more sense.
And we should see in the just the generic analyses, and all of the runs we're doing will include wind as candidate resource. So we should be able to see if economically, with just the longer gen tie lines to get the wind down into El Paso's territory, if it's economic or not.
Right. Okay. Terrific. And then so that's mandatory rates, and then distributed battery storage, I guess, would be that scribble that Margie put up with there. And Margie, were you trying to mock me, Margie? My handwriting? Anyway.
As you recall, we were collaborating in a short amount of time.
It was a collaboration, but now I'm embarrassed. But anyway, no, thank you, because you were very helpful and I really appreciate it. On the distributed battery storage, the basic idea there is that when you do distributed battery storage, you're helping in two ways. And I kind of wanted to see if we could get modeling that addresses that. And you're affecting a distribution investment, and you're affecting peak load because you're shifting load. And both of those have cost impacts. And so the idea here was to see if we could model a situation where you're taking some fairly congested circuits and you're putting a battery program and actually, I would say, an integrated demand management program in place on those circuits. And, you know, how could you model that? And of course, the idea is to reduce peak load on the system, which reduces future distribution, transmission, and generation investment. So I'm struggling to see if there's a way that we can model doing that kind of thing and the effect it might have on the system.
And Steve, are you talking about batteries on the customer side of the meter or the utility side of the meter?
You know, first of all, customer, I think, can have the biggest impacts on the system, but it might make sense to, you know, have batteries at certain locations on particular circuits or feeders. So, you know, again, that's the technical folks who need to advise us on that.
So I see Angie has her hand up. I'm happy to jump in after Angie does.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I apologize. We just submitted our form a couple of minutes ago, but in that form, we actually proposed a residential demand response program with residential batteries located on customer side of the meter for about 500 batteries. So if you can look at that and at that proposal, we actually have some cost estimates there. And we propose two scenarios, one for EPE to own batteries, which will give us an ability to put them in the more congested areas of the grid, right? And the second option that we proposed is just an incentive program, similar to how our smart thermostat program works, where we give customers incentives for installing smart thermostats. We would give them incentives for installing residential battery storage in their home. So you do have some rough numbers from us estimated there. On how much we're projecting it's going to cost for the 3-year period for both scenarios, EP owned and customer owned batteries. But in both scenarios, they would be located on customer side of the meter. And we just proposed residential scenario for now, not small commercial, but we can certainly calculate numbers for those if needed, but you have some assumptions there, Ben. And we looked at other utilities and what they're offering, and some utilities are offering incentives to customers for enrolling their batteries in DR, which range from like $100 per kW to about $400 per kW. And I think we're projecting to maybe go somewhere in the middle at 200. And then on the utility owned, an average price to install a battery and add it to a customer that has rooftop solar system at their property right now in our service territories, $16,000 to $20,000. So that's our main assumption for EP owned. So long story short, we have submitted a form. You have some dollar numbers there, and you have the megawatts of potential DR. I do want to say that when we talk to other utilities and battery storage providers, all of them have said that usually you run these for about 1 to 2 hours. So I don't know how helpful those would be for our entire peak window. But we can certainly run them up to 4 hours. But the general consensus in the industry that a good practice of running these batteries for about an hour or two for demand response, and leaving about 20% of charge left in the battery so customer has that energy in case of an outage, right? So they can have some backup power and some energy left in the battery. So that's our assumption.
Sorry, so Angie, this is Judy. Yeah, just yeah, so we've not seen that modeling request. But again, I think it's been said, like, we're not looking at any sort of pricing or rates right now as far as the model. And I think we wanted to really just focus this conversation here on making sure that we're running through the modeling requests that we have right now and getting some clarification on that. So I just really quickly, Ben, did you have any additional questions for Mr. Fishman with regards to his modeling form?
Yeah, so I think maybe just to break them down just real quickly, go into the batteries on the distribution system. That can be done. It is a little bit challenging, so maybe let me just talk you through just real quickly how we could incorporate that. So the energy and capacity piece is extremely easy. Okay, so if you build distribution connected batteries, you're going to avoid capacity, and also you're going to have energy arbitrage benefits. Those are exactly the same benefits as you see with supply side or transmission connected batteries. That will be connected or will be calculated in the model. That's the easy part. Where it gets a little bit more tricky is when you start looking at things like avoided distribution, just because the model doesn't incorporate a phone, bus branch, node, or representation of the transmission system. So the way we probably can work around that in the interim is to do just some sort of like avoided T&D cost deduction to those resources. So you just say, okay, the cost of these resources, and Steve, I'm making this up, is $100 a kW year. And we think the avoided T&D through separate studies is $10 a kW year. You essentially model those distribution connected resources up the net cost, the $90 a kW year. And that is like the simplest way of doing those sort of calculations. And I think that's probably what we can achieve in the time frame we have. My other suggestion, one way we could look at doing this, is we could force those resources into the model. We'll do a scenario where we force them in. Now, the likely answer is they will be more expensive than supply side resources if you only look at capacity and energy, right? We could then look at the delta and say, okay, to do a distribution solution, just because of economies of scale, is $10 million more expensive. However, do we think that these resources provide at least $10 million of additional benefits that are not calculated through the model? Avoided T&D, power system stability, all of these additional benefits you can't typically capture. And we can also do it that way and say, no, actually, we think the unquantified benefits exceed the costs. That I think may be the easiest way, and that gives you actually two answers. It also lets you know kind of how far out those resources are from being selected and what needs to be calculated. So I think that's my recommendation, Steve. That's how I would approach that. Model them in the model. So model distribution resources in Plexos in the model with their capacity and energy benefits, force them in, see how far out of the money they are, and then see if the benefits that were not captured within the model would exceed those additional costs.
Yeah, that all makes sense. And it's a little bit of a guessing game from a modeling standpoint. But I think the important piece, as I'm thinking of it, is that you can do behind the meter battery programs, and utility owned is great because customers don't have big upfront costs that way. So certainly I support that. But you want to do it where it has the most bang for the buck. So to put a bunch of behind the meter batteries where there's, tons of capacity in the transmission distribution system doesn't make a lot of sense. You put it where you get most bang for the buck. And how do you model it that way? And I think that gets you the true benefits. I think the other thing is that when you're looking at the investment cost and modeling, you need to look carefully at what the cost of energy is at peak and use that as for your modeling assumptions, as opposed to an average rate throughout the day.
Sorry, Steve, I didn't mean to talk about. Just to clarify, we absolutely only use the cost of the energy at that moment in time. We don't use averages at all.
Okay, great. And okay. Anything else that we need to be thinking about there?
Yes, Steve, I did want to clarify one thing. You talk about behind the meter battery. Typically, that's often residentially paired with solar. Did you want to look at maybe like a solar storage solution as just opposed to a standalone battery solution?
I think it's good because I think, you guys might be facing some, or EPE might be facing some backfeed issues down the road. And I don't know if behind the metery batteries, it would seem they might help with that as you expand residential solar. So I think there's a lot of benefits to looking at that kind of scenario.
Okay, and I think this all ties out with like Cynthia's comments earlier about AMI. I mean, this is we're heading essentially more towards a virtual power plant situation than we are just a single technology. Okay.
Right.
So
yeah, and so let me just add in that, Ben, I know there are other people that have been talking about virtual power plant and other customer cited generation resources. We don't have all those people on this call, and we actually have not received any modeling request forms on that. We might have to wait and regroup with that topic as when we get to April 1st, because I think there are people that are putting ideas in there, but we haven't seen them yet.
Yeah.
And I
Margie, do you mind if I just...
Ben, I had a
go ahead,
clarification for you on marginal costs. I know you do time differentiated energy costs, but I'm not sure that your capacity avoided costs are time differentiated, at least what was included in the 25-27 EE load management plan. So
no, and Cynthia, just
that's something I just wanted clarification on.
Yeah, just to clarify to my comments earlier to Mr. Fishman in terms of like how we look at energy. So from a modeling perspective, we do not incorporate rate structures at all. Everything we're looking at is marginal energy and avoided capacity. So when we model it on an hourly basis, we will look at the marginal energy cost on an hourly basis, regardless of what rate structures are in place.
Right. No, I understand. I'm saying that your generation capacity avoided cost is an average annual. I don't believe it's a time differentiated.
Well, so here's what's going to happen in the modeling perspective, again, not in rates, is if you avoid, for example, 10 megawatts of peak capacity need, the model in theory would have to pick 10 megawatts or could pick 10 megawatts less of accredited capacity during that time period. So it would potentially defer the cost of a battery or defer the cost of a CT. So the model itself is looking at meeting your reliability requirements in every year. So it is time sequential.
Okay, I get that from the modeling perspective, but then if we're still also working in the world of does this program or activity make economic sense from before you put it into a model? I'm just saying that your avoided costs on capacity really understate the value to the utility and to the customer. That's my understanding. Anyway, let's talk about that later.
Okay. I'll take that as a note, Cynthia.
Thank you.
So this
Okay,
is
so
Judy.
just to
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to defer to you, Ben, to see if you had any additional questions with regards to the model scenarios that have been submitted. I know we only have about 5 minutes left, but I just want to make sure that you have all the information you need and we have everything clarified to the best extent possible.
Yeah, I maybe kind of pull on some themes here of what I heard, and then happy to have subsequent conversations. But what I'm hearing at a high level is a lot of appetite to do a demand response analysis or scenario. Don gave us some quantities in terms of 10, 15%. Ramon gave us some hard numbers in the 15 megawatt type of range with the two programs added together. So I think we can certainly look at doing a DR which addresses both of those requests. Hearing about a lot of appetite for time of use rates. Ramon quantified, the percentage of number of residential customers. I think we need to convert that, Judy, and we need EP's help in terms of how does that shift load from 1 hour to the next, as opposed to percentage of customers enrolled. So that's something we can go back to the group on. So demand response, time of use rates, there seem to be unanimous requests there. And then Mr. Fishman at the end requested a distribution connected behind the meter storage solution, which we could potentially expand to be solar and storage. And then I'm hearing, Margie, that's probably going to align with at least what Chris Hickman and others are talking about submitting as well. So where I think we should look at this at a high level is at least one scenario that just does DR. So we can kind of isolate the impact and the benefits of a demand response program. We should look at one scenario that does time of use rates, so we can see how TOU impacts the portfolio. One scenario in which we do some sort of behind the meter virtual power plant type arrangement where we do distributed connected, solar, storage, potentially demand response for the residential side, and then also increased energy efficiency. And then probably a fourth scenario where we combine all three and see what the total impact of doing those three types of programs would be. Margie, do you think that was a fair synopsis of kind of all of the requests we've got so far?
Yeah, Ben, except I didn't follow the fourth one, the combination of the three, including time of use rates, behind the meter, resources, and what was the third? I mean, because the first scenario is really DR potential as the big picture.
Yeah, so it would be, one would be just DR, so we can
Yep.
isolate the benefits of DR. Two would be just TOU, so we could isolate the benefits of TOU. Three would just be essentially behind the meter generation, and then four would be all of the above.
Okay, I think that makes sense.
Can I ask just real quickly, I'm assuming that Angie's proposal will circle back in somewhere else then?
Yeah, so Angie's proposal would come into that third one when we start looking at behind the meter storage,
Okay.
solar, etc. We can lean upon the utilities since they've already done some of the work.
Great. Yeah, great. Thanks.
And then, sorry, Randy, I see a comment coming through. Let me just quickly.
Yeah, I think we've talked around the customer-owned demand response. Let's look at what additional solar and utility battery could potentially do. I think the answer is the same. It's just the utility has the option to put it where it meets the most, kind of along Steve's line of where do you place a battery system or a solar to best impact demand response.
Okay, so Randy, maybe just to summarize there, we're looking at maybe organic demand response in terms of the residential or the commercial customers just assigned to DR programs, as opposed to targeted, optimized demand response, where you say, hey, based on your location on the distribution system or the transmission system, essentially we would try and encourage you to be on a DR type program.
I don't know if I'm looking at this from the perspective of the customer and more from the system's perspective of where on the system would demand response be most impactful.
Okay, and that goes back to my earlier comment, like we're not going to be able to calculate nodal benefits of demand response in this analysis. The only way we could capture geographical or system benefits would just be on that avoided T&D. So we could say, hey, the avoided transmission distribution costs are $10 a kW year if they're in this part of the system. It may be they're $20 a kW year if they're on another part of the system. Does that meet your needs?
Yeah, no, that's good. I think maybe I'll reword this a different way. Is if you had excess solar, does that shift the demand to the right later in the day, and then a battery can pick up a shorter period of that peak demand, assuming that for horse occurs in the summer when you have a wider window of solar production.
Got it. Okay, and then Cynthia just asked, are we modeling demand response based on current programs? Rhonda, are you still on the call right now?
She had to drop. We have a conflicting meeting right now at 11.
Okay, Cynthia, if you don't mind, I want to get back to you on that one. I've got the, I just need to look at the loads and resources table and see if these numbers of 79 megawatts are constant year on year, or if it grows in the future for new programs. So if you don't mind, I can respond to it as an email to this group and answer that question very shortly.
Great. Well, thank you all for your questions and discussion, Ben. I think you've done a good summary of next steps, and this will be conversation that's reflected back to all stakeholders during workshop number 4, along with any other model requests that have been developed and fine-tuned with the help of the EPE and E3 team. I want to remind everybody on the phone, if you have not yet turned in your contact information form so that you can have access to the SharePoint, you need to do that to be able to get detailed information that will be posted throughout this process. So please do that if you have not already sent that in. And Angie, I'm going to have you talk with your team at EPE about the information. I don't think the modeling request form is necessarily the best format for your input, but I think the EPE team would definitely benefit from the material you've put together. Judy, Ben or Judy, is there anything else we need to cover today with this group?
Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
I have questions regarding the market potential report that you distributed. Who should I direct those questions to? I can send via email.
So, Mr. Simpson, thank you for your question. Yeah, I think with regards to the market potential study, we don't have the appropriate individuals on this call, but we did send that to you. I think it would be more appropriate maybe for a later meeting, maybe with this group or maybe at workshop number 4, because again, I did upload that market potential study to the SharePoint, which you all should have access to, and see if there are any other stakeholders that do have questions on that. So just to give us a little bit of time to get the appropriate individuals there to help answer those questions.
To do it that way versus email?
Yeah, versus email. Yes. Yeah, I think it would be better that way versus email.
Okay.
Judy, let me make sure I understand. So are you offering to host a discussion with people who have questions about that study, or tell me again what you want to talk about it offline and figure out how to best handle this?
I think we need to talk about it offline. Yes.
Okay, because
I think that would be
it's not directly part of the modeling run requests. But Phil, we understand that you might have questions and others might as well. It might be something that we do outside of the IRP modeling discussions. So let us get back to you, Phil, on that to come up with a process for any additional questions about the market potential report. I think perhaps PRC staff also have some questions about it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, thank you all. Deborah has put into the chat, we will record this session and post it on the GridWorks website in case you have colleagues who want to listen to the conversation. Thank you all for putting together run requests and being willing to work on refining and collaborating those to get the best input and the most efficient way of handling these requests with the EPE and E3 teams. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you all at Workshop 4 in April. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.